The judging tent at the Thistledown Harvest Fête smelled of cut stems and cold lemonade, and Honora Pryce had her hands in the dahlia display when she said, loudly enough for the next table to hear, that whoever had classified the pom-poms alongside the decoratives had never actually grown either variety and ought to be prevented from handling a ribbon until they had. The September afternoon pressed warm against the canvas walls, and the tent was full of the particular noise of English village ceremony. Low conversations, the scrape of chairs, someone's child running where children had been told not to run. Honora did not lower her voice. She had spent 6 years being the sensible widow, the useful woman, the one who organized the subscription accounts and chaired the garden society and never caused anyone a moment's inconvenience. And in the matter of dahlia classification, she was not prepared to be sensible at all. The stems were cold and clean in her fingers. The exhibition table was wrong, and she intended to say so until someone with authority agreed with her. What she did not intend, what she had not prepared for in any version of this ordinary September afternoon, was the voice that came from directly behind her, amused and unhurried, disagreeing with her on a point of horticulture she was unquestionably right about. She turned. The Duke of Wrenfield had been away from Thistledown for 4 years. He was taller than she remembered, which was not fair, and he was grinning at her the way a man grins when he has just found the only interesting person at a very dull party. Which was worse? Pom-poms and decoratives, said Rafe Ashcombe, share a genus. The classification committee is being broadly reasonable. The classification committee, said Honora, is being broadly wrong. Sharing a genus is not the point. Form is the point. A pom-pom is a sphere. A decorative is a flat-faced bloom. Judging them together is like judging a cabbage alongside a rose because both of them grow in dirt. I'm not sure that's the analogy you want, Rafe said. It rather makes the pom-pom sound like a cabbage. My pom-poms, said Honora, could beat your roses. He laughed, not the polished social laugh she had heard attributed to him across a dozen dinner table reports over the years, but something shorter and more surprised. As if she had caught him before he could arrange his face, he put out his hand. Rafe Ashcombe, I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I know who you are, Honora said. Mrs. Pryce. I ran the garden society for your mother for 11 years. She spoke of you, Rafe said. She said you were the only member who ever told her when she was wrong about the compost. She was frequently wrong about the compost, Honora said, and shook his hand. At the far end of the judging table, Mrs. Alderton, who had been listening to the exchange with the expression of a woman composing a letter in her head, while apparently examining a chrysanthemum, leaned toward her neighbor and said, not quite quietly enough, that the Duke would need to think about the succession soon, of course, and that Mrs. Pryce was a perfectly lovely woman. But surely, well, surely at her age, Honora heard it. She heard the pause that preceded it, heard the comfortable way Mrs. Alderton's voice trailed into the ellipsis, trusting that everyone at the table would fill in the rest without being asked. She had heard variations of this sentence for 3 years. She had learned, over those 3 years, that the cleanest way to handle it was to agree before the speaker finished. It removed the awkwardness, demonstrated that she had no illusions, and ended the conversation before anyone felt the need to be kind. She turned back to her dahlias and said pleasantly, "Quite right. Far too old for love." Mrs. Alderton blinked. The woman beside her made a small, uncertain sound. Honora began straightening the stems of her decorative arrangement, which was going to win, regardless of what the committee did with the categories. Behind her, Rafe Ashcombe said. And she heard him clearly, heard the particular quality of a man who had made a decision mid-sentence and was not retreating from it. Fine. Girls bore me. The tent went briefly quiet. Then the conversations resumed, a little faster than before. And Honora kept her eyes on the dahlias and did not turn around, because turning around would have required her to arrange her face into something. And she was not certain what that something should be. By supper, the line had been repeated on the high street, in the post office, and at the butcher's counter. By the following morning, it had reached the rectory. The village of Thistledown had not had this much to discuss since the vicar's pig had escaped into the churchyard in June, and the pig had not been nearly as interesting. Honora's cottage sat at the end of Orchard Lane, behind the old surgery where her husband Thomas had practiced for 22 years, and she had lived in it alone for 6 of them. It was a good cottage, her own, left to her outright, with a physic garden that she maintained with more attention than it strictly required, and a kitchen table large enough for the parish school subscription accounts, which she spread across it every Tuesday evening, with the methodical satisfaction of a woman who liked to know exactly where things stood. Her son Peter arrived for supper that Tuesday, as he did most Tuesdays, with a bottle of something reasonable, and the cheerful expression of a man who had been saving a piece of news all afternoon. "The Duke said you were interesting," Peter said, setting the bottle on the table. "The Duke said girls bore him," Honora said. "That's not the same thing." "He said it because of you." "He said it because Mrs. Alderton implied I was past it, and he was being gallant. It's a different thing entirely." Honora ladled soup into 2 bowls and brought them to the table. "Sit down." Peter sat. He was 31, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's precise manner of saying exactly as much as he meant and no more. He had inherited Thomas's medical practice, Thomas's patience, and, Honora suspected, Thomas's talent for seeing more than he let on. He watched her set the bowls down and reach for the bread, and he said, "You went pink." It was a warm tent. "You went pink," Peter said. When he laughed, I was watching. "You," said Honora, "were supposed to be watching the vegetable marrow competition, which is why I brought you." The marrows were settled by 11 o'clock. I had the whole afternoon free. He broke the bread and handed her half. "He's 42, did you know? Inherited at 26, never married." "I know his family history, Peter. I knew his mother." "I'm just noting," Peter said, "that he's not a child." "No one said he was a child." "You said you were too old for love." Honora looked up from her soup. "I said what Mrs. Alderton was going to say before she could say it with that expression she gets. It saves time." Peter ate his soup without answering. He had his father's patience in that too. The capacity to wait inside a silence without appearing to wait, which Honora had always found more effective than argument. She ate her own soup. The kitchen was warm, the lamp was lit, and outside the lane was dark and quiet and entirely without Dukes. "It was good soup," Peter said, when the bowls were empty. "Thank you." "You know," he said, "you don't actually have to agree with Mrs. Alderton. She's wrong about the dahlia categories, too." Honora laughed, despite herself, and told him to clear the dishes. At Wrenfield Hall, which sat a quarter-mile outside the village, at the end of a beach-lined drive that wanted better gravel, Rafe Ashcombe sat in the library and told his aunt that he had found the fête unexpectedly tolerable. Lady Sybil Trenholm, who was 63, formidable, and had been managing her nephew's social life with the focused attention of a general managing a campaign, set down her teacup. "Tolerable," she said. "Yes," Rafe replied. "You have attended," said Lady Sybil. "The Duchess of Harwick's midsummer ball, Lord Fairfax's shooting party, 3 separate house parties in the home counties, and the opening of the Hendricks Gallery. You described all of them as largely endurable. You are telling me that a village harvest fête was tolerable." "Unexpectedly tolerable," Rafe said. "I thought the distinction mattered." Lady Sybil looked at him for a long moment. She was not a woman who required things spelled out. It was one of her most useful qualities, and at present, one of the most inconvenient. She said, "Mrs. Pryce." Rafe reached for his own cup. "She was right about the dahlias." "She is always right about the dahlias," Lady Sybil said. "She was right about them last year and the year before, and she has been right about them for 11 years running. And the committee has been wrong for 11 years running. And this has never before prompted you to describe the fate as tolerable." "I wasn't here for the last 11 years. "No," said Lady Sybil. "You were not." She picked up her teacup again, set it back down, and said, with the tone of a woman who was going to be very reasonable and meant it to be heard, "She is 47, Rafe. She was the village physician's wife. She has no connections, no fortune, and a grown son. The Marchioness of Esk has a niece who is 24 and perfectly—" "Perfectly what?" Rafe said. Lady Sybil pressed her lips together. She had several words available, none of which would improve the conversation, and she was experienced enough to know when to retreat in good order. She retreated. Rafe sat in the library after she had gone and looked at the fire for some time and thought about a woman who had agreed she was too old for love before anyone had finished the sentence. In the voice of a person who had said it so many times, it had stopped being a joke and become something else. He thought about the dahlias, which were, in fact, the best entry in the tent by a considerable margin. He thought about the way she had not turned around after he spoke. 2 days after the fête, Rafe appeared at Honora's door with a leather folder of papers and the explanation that he had been reviewing the parish school subscription accounts and believed there might be a discrepancy in the quarterly totals that her expertise could resolve. Honora looked at the folder, looked at him, and said that she was the one who kept the subscription accounts, and there were no discrepancies in the quarterly totals. "Then perhaps you could confirm that," Rafe said, "for my peace of mind." The butcher on the high street. When this visit was reported to him by his wife, who had seen the Duke walk down Orchard Lane at 10 in the morning with a folder of papers and emerge again 2 hours later without it, identified the pretense for what it was before the week was out. He shared this identification with his Tuesday customers, who shared it with their Thursday neighbors. And by the following weekend, Thistledown had a secondary subject of conversation to run alongside the dahlia argument. Honora, for her part, accepted the pretext without acknowledging it, set Rafe to work at her kitchen table, and made tea. He came back the following Tuesday. Then, the Tuesday after that. The accounts, which were in excellent order, took approximately 40 minutes to review. The remaining time was occupied by a disagreement about whether the school's heating expenditure could be reduced by a third without affecting the pupils, which became a disagreement about the quality of the coal merchant's current supply, which became a conversation about the Garden Society's plans for the spring exhibition, which ended, both of them surprised to find the lamp needed trimming, at 7:30 in the evening. During the second Tuesday visit, they were sorting through the leftover materials from the fête, ribbons, labels, spare pins, that Honora had agreed to store until the committee met again in November. She reached for a spool of red ribbon at the same moment he did. His hand closed over hers half a second before either of them noticed, warm and certain, and he did not move it with the speed that manners required. Neither of them spoke. The kitchen was quiet, except for the small sounds of the house settling in the October afternoon. Honora looked at his hand, and then at the spool, and then picked up a different spool with her other hand, and said that the red was for the vegetable categories, and the blue was for the florals, and they should be kept separate, or there would be confusion in November. Rafe agreed that there would be confusion in November, and moved his hand. Lady Sybil learned about the Tuesday visits from her housekeeper, who had it from the greengrocer, who had it from the greengrocer's daughter, who had seen the Duke's horse tied to the fence at Orchard Lane on 2 consecutive Tuesdays. Lady Sybil sat with this information for one day. Then she wrote a note to the subscribers' dinner committee, regretfully withdrawing Mrs. Pryce's name from the invitation list, on the grounds that Mrs. Pryce had mentioned, she believed, a prior engagement in October that would make attendance difficult. Mrs. Pryce had not mentioned any such thing. Lady Sybil was aware of this. She composed the note anyway, sealed it, and told herself she was being practical. The orangery at Wrenfield Hall had been his mother's project, and Rafe had let it go in the 4 years he had mostly lived in London. The fruit trees that had been trained along the south wall had begun to lean away from their trellises. The wires needed tightening, and the whole structure required the kind of attention that Rafe told Honora on the Thursday he appeared at her door in early October. He had absolutely no idea how to give it. Honora looked at him. "Your mother showed me this orangery for 2 years," she said. "She knew exactly how to tie back a fruit tree. It is not complicated." "It's been 4 years," Rafe said. "I've forgotten." "You were not there to learn it." "No," he said, and something in his voice shifted, not much. Just enough that she heard it. "I wasn't." She went. The orangery was worse than she had expected. 3 of the pear trees had come almost entirely free of their supports, and the wire along the south wall had rusted in 2 places. She walked the length of it with her hands clasped behind her back and delivered her assessment without softening it, because she did not see the point of softening it. The neglect was visible, the work was considerable, and he was standing beside her, looking at it with an expression that had nothing to do with the trees. "Your mother loved this room," Honora said. "I know," Rafe said. "She used to bring the Garden Society in October to see the late pears. She was very proud of the Bure Bosque." Honora stopped in front of the tallest tree, which had leaned so far from its trellis that the main stem was nearly horizontal. "This one needs 2 people." She reached up to take hold of the trellis and guide the stem back toward it. He reached at the same moment, his arm alongside hers, and his hand covered hers on the wooden frame. Not by accident this time, not half a second too slow to be intention. Deliberately, and with full awareness of what he was doing. He held it there. The tree was heavy and green and smelled of old wood and damp, and the October light came through the glass in long pale strips across the floor. Honora did not pull away. She said, without moving, "You'll need to hold it there while I reach the wire." "All right," Rafe said. She reached the wire with her free hand and looped it twice around the stem, and they stood like that for the time it took to make the knot, which was not a long time, and was not a short one either. On market day the following week, the sky fell without warning. One moment the high street was ordinary October sunshine, and the next it was a September downpour that had apparently been waiting behind the church tower for the precise moment when the most people were standing in the open with parcels. Honora had 2 bags of apples, a length of blue wool, and no umbrella, and she was calculating which of the stalls had the best cover when Rafe appeared from the direction of the ironmonger's, shrugged off his coat without asking, held it above both their heads, took the apple bags from her hands, and ran. They arrived under the covered stalls, laughing and soaked through regardless, because the coat was one coat and they were 2 people, and the rain was comprehensive. The apples survived. The wool did not. Honora looked at the wet length of blue in her hands, and then at Rafe, who was attempting to wring water from his coat sleeve with the expression of a man who has just realized that his plan had a significant structural flaw. And she laughed so hard that the woman at the flower stall looked over to see what had happened. The village saw this. The village discussed it at length. By the following Sunday, there were 2 settled camps. Those who thought it was charming, and those who thought it was unsuitable. And both camps agreed that something was definitely happening. For Honora, the bickering over the orangery's drainage and the school's quarterly ledger had become, by the end of October, the clearest point in the week. She did not say this to anyone, including herself. She noted it, set it aside, and kept the Tuesday visits firmly labeled as what they were supposed to be. The parish bake sale was held on the first Saturday of November in the village hall, with Lady Sybil presiding over the judging table with the authority of a woman who had presided over it for 20 years and intended to preside over it for 20 more. She had prepared before arriving a clear and reasonable speech. She had rehearsed the key points. She had the succession mathematics ready, the relevant precedents from 2 other ducal families she could cite if necessary, and the firm but not unkind tone she reserved for conversations that needed to be over quickly. She found Honora at the jam table, examining a label with the expression of a woman who has found an error and is deciding how to raise it. "Mrs. Pryce," Lady Sybil said. "A word, if I may." "The raspberry and the black currant are in the wrong order," Honora said, without looking up. "The judging criteria list raspberry first. If the black currant wins on presentation alone, you'll have complaints." Lady Sybil looked at the table. The raspberry was, in fact, in the wrong position. She rearranged it, because she was not going to be wrong about the jam table in front of this particular woman, if she could help it, and said, "I wanted to speak with you about my nephew." "I assumed so," Honora said. "Then you understand that I have the family's interests to consider." "I understand that you believe you do," Honora said pleasantly, and moved to examine the next row of entries. Lady Sybil followed her. "Mrs. Pryce, the Duke of Wrenfield requires a wife of appropriate birth and a suitable connection for the succession. Yes, I know the argument." Honora picked up a jar of gooseberry preserve and turned it in the light. "I've heard it several times, including once from myself. You're not telling me anything I haven't already told him or myself or the dahlias. Then you see why the present situation—" "What I see," said Honora, setting the jar down and turning to face her, "is a man who came home after 4 years and has spent 6 Tuesdays arguing with me about coal costs and compost rotation, and who seems, for reasons I cannot entirely explain, to find this preferable to the alternative." She paused. "I find it preferable too. I'm not sure what you want me to do about that." Lady Sybil opened her mouth. She had the speech ready. She had the precedents. She had the tone. What she said, after a moment, was, "Your dahlia entry at the fête was the best thing on that table in 15 years. Honora blinked. "The blushing bride arrangement," Lady Sybil said. "The color gradation was exceptional. I have been judging that table since 1878. And I gave you second place because I was not going to give a first to a woman my nephew had just made a spectacle of. And I have been irritated about it ever since." She straightened her jacket. "That is not a withdrawal of my concerns. I still have them. I am simply telling you that I have also enjoyed this conversation more than any conversation at any fête in 15 years, which is inconvenient." Honora looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "The blushing bride needed a darker stem at the center. I knew it when I arranged it." "Yes," said Lady Sybil. "It did. It still won." She retreated to the judging table without delivering the warning, which she told herself she had simply postponed. She was aware that this was not entirely true. The same week, on a Sunday evening after church, Peter sat down across from his mother at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "I've been hoping you'd remarry for over a year." Honora looked up from the accounts she was not really reading. "I've been embarrassed," Peter said, "that you've spent that year assuming you needed my permission to be happy. I want you to know that you don't. You never did." He folded his hands on the table in the way he had inherited from his father, the gesture of a man who is prepared to say a difficult thing and is not going to unsay it. "And I want you to stop pretending the Tuesday visits are about the school accounts. The accounts are perfect. They have always been perfect. He is not here for the accounts." Honora said nothing. "Mom," Peter said, "he rode through a rainstorm to stand under a coat with you on the high street, in front of everyone." "It was a market day downpour," Honora said. He was being ridiculous," Peter said. "On purpose, because he wanted to." He stood and began clearing the teacups. "I'm not going to say anything else about it. I just wanted you to know." Honora sat at the kitchen table after he had gone to wash up, and she thought about Lady Sybil's expression over the gooseberry preserve, and Peter's folded hands, and the joke she had been making for 3 years, far too old for love, quite right, before anyone could finish the sentence. And she sat with the unfamiliar sensation that the joke might not be the wisest thing she had ever said. It might only have been the easiest. Lady Sybil's letter to a connection in London, a careful civil note to the Marchioness of Esk describing an unfortunate local attachment and requesting the Marchioness's perspective on the family's marriage settlements, had been written 3 weeks before the bake sale and sent with the confidence of a woman who believed she was acting in her nephew's best interests. She had not anticipated the route the letter's contents would take through the village. She had not anticipated that the Marchioness's companion would mention the matter to the Marchioness's niece's husband's solicitor, who happened to have a brother in the county, who happened to know the Thistledown schoolmaster, who phrased the thing badly when he passed it along. The rumor that reached Peter was not Lady Sybil's careful language. It was the version that had traveled through 6 sets of hands and arrived with sharp edges, that Mrs. Pryce had attached herself to the Duke of Wrenfield with an eye to his fortune, that the family was aware of it, and that the situation was being managed accordingly. Peter came to his mother on a Wednesday morning, and he was not teasing, and he was not easy. And the distress on his face was the kind that comes from hearing something that fits badly against everything you know and not being certain where the fault lies. "I need to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to answer me plainly." Honora put down the garden shears she was carrying. "Ask. Is any of it true?" She heard the whole rumor in the shape of the question. She heard the 6 sets of hands it had traveled through, and the schoolmaster's version of Lady Sybil's careful letter, and the word fortune hunting that Peter had not used, but that was sitting in the room with them regardless. "No," she said. "None of it." Peter looked at her. He had his father's eyes and his father's patience, and he looked at her the way Thomas had sometimes looked at her, not doubting, but needing to see her face say the thing her voice was saying. Then he nodded once and said, "I know. I'm sorry I asked." "Don't be," Honora said. "You were right to." She waited until he had gone back to the surgery. Then she went inside, washed her hands, put on her coat, and walked to Wrenfield Hall. Rafe was in the front hall when she arrived, coat still on, apparently just returned from somewhere, and he saw her face and went still. She did not sit down. She told him, standing in his front hall with her coat buttoned and her hands at her sides, that she was ending the visits, that the situation was becoming damaging to him, to the household's name, and to her son, who had just been put in the position of asking his mother a question that should never have been available to ask. She told him that she had no intention of being the scandal everyone quietly managed. She told him that she was grateful for the Tuesdays, and for the orangery, and for the coat in the rain, and that she was asking him to let her go before the thing became something that hurt more people than it already had. Rafe did not argue. He did not produce a clever line. He crossed the hall, took both her hands in his, and held them, not urgently, not dramatically, just firmly, the way a person holds something they are not ready to set down, and said nothing while she worked through every version of the reason she should go. She went anyway. She said the last version of the reason, and he released her hands, and she went. He stood in the hall for some time after the door closed. Then he went to find Lady Sybil, and the conversation he had with her was not long, and was not charming. And at the end of it, she sat in her chair with the expression of a woman who has been told a plain truth and is not certain she deserves to have heard it so plainly, and said nothing at all. Rafe arrived at Honora's door the following morning before 7 o'clock, having ridden through the night, which meant he was cold and damp and had not slept. And he looked, Honora thought, when she opened the door and found him there, like a man who had made a decision somewhere in the dark between midnight and dawn, and was not going to wait for a better hour to act on it. "I owe you an honest account," he said. "May I come in?" She stepped back from the door. He came into the kitchen, and she put the kettle on, and he sat at the table, her table, the Tuesday table, the accounts table, and said, without preamble and without charm, that he had let his aunt's version of her exist unchallenged in his own house for a week before he thought to act on it, and that this was a failure he was naming plainly rather than charming his way around, because charming his way around things was what he had been doing for so long that he had stopped noticing he was doing it. And with her, for reasons he was only now beginning to understand, it had cost him something real. Honora set the kettle down and turned to face him. "I'm not hurt about the money," she said. "I want you to understand that clearly. I have never in my life made a decision based on a man's income, and I am not about to begin at 47. "I know that," Rafe said. "What I am hurt about," she said, "is that the rumor stood. For a week in your house, a version of me that I had no part in creating was allowed to stand unchallenged. And I have spent 6 years being the reliable, useful widow whom this village calls on for everything and gossips about for nothing. And I will not add convenient scandal to that accounting. I won't." "No," Rafe said. "You shouldn't have to. I need you to understand that this is not about dignity in the abstract. It is about the specific experience of being a woman in a small place who has built a specific reputation over a specific number of years, and having that reputation treated as a thing that can be quietly set aside when it becomes inconvenient for someone else's family." "I understand," Rafe said. He looked at the table for a moment, and then back at her. "I've been running my easy charm at everyone for so long that I stopped being able to tell the difference between performing and meaning it. With you, I mean it. I have meant it since the dahlias. And I let the performance serve as cover for the week. It should have cost me something. And it did cost me something. And I'm telling you so plainly because I don't know how else to say it, and I'm not willing to say it cleverly." Honora looked at him. He was sitting at her kitchen table in a coat he had ridden through the night in, saying the least elegant thing she had ever heard him say. And it was, she found, to her own surprise, the most she had ever believed him. She kissed him, laughing, mid-sentence of something she had been planning to say, because it was the least clever thing he had ever told her and the most honest. And she kissed him with the particular relief of a woman who has been holding herself carefully upright for 6 years and has just set something heavy down. He kissed her back, and the kettle began to whistle, and neither of them moved to take it off for a considerable time. 1 year later, the Thistledown Harvest Fête returned to the same tent, the same judging table, the same September afternoon pressing warm against the canvas, while the first chill of evening waited just outside. Honora had entered the dahlias again. A different arrangement this year. The café au lait variety she had been cultivating since March, in shades that moved from pale cream through gold to a deep, burnt amber at the center. She had spent considerable time on the center. She was not going to lose on the center 2 years running. The Dowager Marchioness of Esk was seated at the far end of the judges' table, which Honora noticed when she arrived and registered without visible reaction, because she had spent a year becoming better at registering things without visible reaction and had made measurable progress. Lady Sybil had invited the Dowager, she knew, out of old habit and older fear, the fear that had never quite resolved itself into either approval or opposition, but had been living, for 12 months, somewhere in the uneasy territory between them. The Dowager was formidable. She had strong opinions about succession mathematics and had communicated them, at intervals, to anyone connected to the Wrenfield family who would listen. The judging proceeded through the vegetable categories, through the preserves, through the dried flower arrangements. Honora stood at the end of the table and watched the committee work through the florals with the attention of a woman who knew exactly what she had entered and had a considered opinion about every other entry as well. The head judge lifted the blue ribbon. He looked at the café au lait arrangement and at the runner-up, a competent but conservative spray of chrysanthemums, and he pinned the ribbon to Honora's arrangement with the decisive movement of a man who has no doubt about the decision. The Dowager Marchioness of Esk, who had been watching this from her seat with the expression of a woman who had come prepared for a specific purpose, turned in her chair and addressed Honora directly. "Mrs. Pryce," she said, with the clarity of a woman who has no interest in being misheard, "I understand you have been keeping company with the Duke of Wrenfield." "Yes," Honora said steadily. "I wonder," said the Dowager, "whether you have given adequate consideration to the realities of your position. Your birth, your age, the absence of any connection that would be useful to the family, and of course the matter of the succession, which requires—" She did not finish the sentence. Rafe had been standing 3 feet away at the edge of the judging table, and he moved with the deliberate, unhurried certainty of a man who has made a decision and is not interested in being talked out of it. He reached the head judge's table, unpinned the blue ribbon from Honora's arrangement with 2 fingers, and pinned it, carefully, visibly, without any appearance of haste, to his own lapel. The tent went quiet. Rafe turned to face the Dowager, and he said, in the conversational tone of a man reporting a fact, "I have spent a considerable sum of money and 4 complete London seasons attempting to be appropriately bored by the right kind of woman. I have attended the right dinners, the right balls, the right house parties, and I have met the right daughters of the right families, and I have failed, comprehensively, to be interested in a single one of them. Not because they were wrong, but because I was performing not being interested in anything, which is an exhausting thing to perform for 20 years and tends to become true if you do it long enough." He paused. Mrs. Pryce argued with me about compost rotation on the first afternoon I spoke to her, he said. She was right about the compost. She was right about the dahlias. She was right about the coal merchant and the school accounts and the pear trees in the orangery and the raspberry preserve on the jam table. And she has been right, consistently and without apology, about every single thing she has had an opinion about in the 14 months I have known her. I find this, he appeared to consider the word, remarkable. He looked at the dowager. The succession will be managed, he said. I have a cousin in Shropshire who is perfectly suitable and will be delighted. I have written to him. He turned to Honora. The tent was still quiet. At the back, someone's child had stopped running. Mrs. Alderton, who had started the whole business 1 year ago with an ellipsis, was standing with her hands pressed together, watching with the expression of a woman who has arrived at a public event, expecting a flower show, and is getting something considerably more interesting. I am asking you, Rafe said, and his voice was not charming now, not performing, just steady and plain and entirely his, whether you would like to keep failing to be bored, together, for the remainder of both our lives. Honora said yes. She said it before he had quite finished the question, laughing, the way she had laughed in the kitchen on the morning he had ridden through the night, to say the least clever thing he had ever told her. And the laughter was not dismissal and was not nerves. It was the sound of a woman who has been carrying a joke for 3 years and has just put it down for good. The Dowager Marchioness of Esk, who had prepared a verdict and been given absurdity instead, looked at the man with the blue ribbon on his lapel and the woman laughing beside him, and opened her mouth and closed it again. She had been formidable at every dinner table in England for 40 years. She had no prepared response for this particular combination of events. She had nothing useful to add. The tent did not empty all at once. It emptied the way fête tents always empty at the end of the afternoon, in small groups, by conversation, with the particular reluctance of people who have been warm and entertained and are not yet ready to go back to the lane. The lanterns came up as the daylight thinned, casting the canvas walls in amber, and the dahlias on the judging table caught the light and held it. Lady Sybil made her way across the tent when the crowd had thinned enough to move without ceremony. She reached Rafe and Honora where they stood near the judging table, and she did not say she was sorry. She was not built for direct apology, and they both knew it, and the knowledge sat between all three of them without being unkind. She reached up and straightened the blue ribbon on Rafe's lapel, which had gone slightly crooked during the proposal, and she adjusted it with the precise attention of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing with her hands. "It looks better there than it would have on the arrangement," she said, and stepped back and said nothing else. Peter was at the far end of the tent, and he had come to the fête this year with the clear and cheerful intention of watching all of this happen, because he had known, for some months, that it would. He crossed to Rafe and shook his hand with the steady grip of a man who has made his decision quietly and some time ago and does not need to make a speech about it. He held the grip for a moment, then he let go and said, "She'll argue with you about the orangery drainage until Easter." "I know," Rafe said. "She's right about it," Peter said, "just so you're prepared." "I know that too," Rafe said. And Peter laughed and went to find the cider, which was the thistledown fate's only reliable consolation for the end of September. The tent emptied around them gradually, in the slow amber light of the lanterns, and the last people out were the committee members carrying the entry labels and the spare ribbons and the judging forms. And then the committee members were gone too, and the tent held only the tables and the flowers and the chairs, and on the back of one chair near the judge's table, A coat and a pair of gloves left tangled together by two people who had not thought about their coats or their gloves for some time. Outside, the lane back toward Wrenfield Hall was dark, and the first chill of autumn evening was coming in from the fields on both sides. Not the false cold of a September afternoon that will warm again by noon, but the real cold, the kind that means something, the kind that arrives in the evening and stays. The beech trees along the drive had begun to turn, and the gravel needed better laying, and the stars were starting to come through above the fields in the way they do in the country when the last light goes. Rafe and Honora walked the lane unhurried, not explaining themselves to anyone, because there was no one left in the lane to explain themselves to, and they had no particular interest in the explaining anyway. The fête was behind them, and the village was behind them, and the long business of being sensible and useful and finished and too old was behind them, and ahead was the hall with its orangery and its Tuesday table and its pear trees that needed attention in the spring. She was not too old. She had never been too old. She had only for a little while agreed that she was, because it was easier than hoping, and hoping, she had discovered, was the most inconvenient thing in the world and also the most necessary. And she had been right about the dahlias all along.